Thank you. Yeah, I must second in full your sort of take home message. Do reach out. I think that's how these interdisciplinary efforts come to be. If we dare to, just as you did, to just, reach out and say, this is cool. Let's mingle and let's see how we can scaffold this into something more meaningful. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here as part of these scaffolds that we are creating with Merle. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Yasmin, for all the back end of this too. Um, and thank you for the introduction. Yeah. Um, Today, I'm excited to share a geometry for sense making. I'll present a new framework or a method to understand intersubjective phenomena, in this case, framed as presence. That is the feeling of being together and, let's say, in the moment with others. Um, in the case of our framework, it is understood from a geometric perspective. My name is Nicolás Hinrichs, and I'll try to bridge some insights from neuroscience as they apply to virtual reality, social robotics, perhaps even performance studies, and certainly philosophy. So we will start by pinpointing a way in which presence emerges as a dynamic interplay of perception, cognition, and social interaction, thus cutting through all these domains that I just mentioned, and how we can actually measure and shape this interplay using tools from specifically network geometry and situate the results or those proxy measures within the active inference framework. So by the end of the presentation, I hope you'll see how a geometric approach, something that sounds very math-y, can turn this elusive experience of being together into something we can actually quantify and perhaps even manipulate, um, maybe even providing thus a common ground for all of our disciplines. Hoping you can see the first slide after the title one. Um, let's start by unpacking what we mean by presence. So in this case, I'm talking about social presence, that sense of being connected or in sync with someone, whether face to face or in this case, somewhat digital or even virtual environment. So crucially, presence is not a solo phenomenon, right? It is co-constructed during interpersonal interactions. It emerges from a dynamic interplay, as we were saying, between what we perceive, how we think, and how we engage in social situations. This makes presence per default a rich and interdisciplinary concept. For example, in virtual reality, we ask how to create the illusion of being together across distance. Or in social robotics, we wonder how a robot can feel truly engaging or present to a human. In performance art, presence might even describe this, connection between performance and audience and how palpable that is. And certainly philosophers have pondered what it means to be truly with another person. The challenge in all these cases is that presence is intangible and dynamic, as we said. So, how can we pin it down scientifically without losing that richness that we're looking for? So, I'll propose that by viewing interaction through a geometric lens or by grounding the methods of its analysis in geometry, we can capture the ebb and flow of presence in a way that's measurable, meaningful, and ultimately tangible across our domains. So before I go into brains and geometry, let's start with theory. I draw a lot on the enactive approach in cognitive science, particularly the idea of participatory sense making. This concept by De Jager and Di Paolo basically tells us that when two people interact, they actively co-create meaning together. So in other words, understanding and sense making are participatory per default. They don't just reside in my skull or mind, or the one of the other interacting agent, but in the dynamic coupling between us. This goes hand in hand with embodied cognition, the view that our mind isn't divorced from our bodies or environment, but actually our cognition is deeply shaped by our bodily interactions, gestures, rhythms, proximities, and context. So why does this matter for presence? It means that to understand presence, we cannot just treat individuals as isolated, although that is somewhat in the etymology of the word. Um, we have to study the interaction as its own unit, right? So we need to reword through this theory what we actually consider our target phenomenon. Almost like an interplay where meaning and presence emerge through the coordination between patterns must be the concept at the forefront or at the center, is what I'm proposing here. So presence as seen as an embodied relational process. And my method is grounded in this idea. So we look at the relational geometry of interaction rather than just the individual behaviors to find where ultimately connection resides. So, as a first step to connect theory with biology, we turn to second person neuroscience by Leo Schielbach, one of our co authors. Traditionally, in a very blunt cartoon way of describing it, social neuroscience might put, person A in scanner one, show them pictures of person B, and thus infer how social processing works. Again, very blunt cartoon. We've moved past that, but this bridge from theory to biology still sort of suffers a little bit from those paradigms or the echo of them. Because we know that life isn't just, one-sided like that. Second person neuroscience says, let's study two people actively engaging with each other in real time, best case scenario. In practice, this often uses hyperscanning, so the recording of brain activity from two or more people simultaneously while they interact. This can be done with EEG, fNIRS, fMRI. There's a little niche of MEG hyperscanning as well. And certainly all other, physiological measures that can be docked on are welcome too, like heart rate variability or this new niche on gut-brain axis at the oscillatory level, etc. This all lets us see how brains or other parts of our physiologies behave during real social encounters like conversation, joint tasks, or even performing together. A key finding from this approach is that interacting brains can show interpersonal neural synchrony, INS. So essentially, the brain signals between people can align or oscillate together in a coordinated way. For example, two people in a good conversation might exhibit synchronized brainwave patterns. And this has been linked with social connection factors, and for instance, studies that show greater synchrony correlates with increased empathy, rapport, and understanding, the feeling of understanding between people. So, in other words, when we're on a same wavelength, literally and figuratively, we tend to feel more connected. So, INS could be a good neural signature of presence. But we need to move one step further from this um, synchrony or this measure that from my perspective, only scratch the surface of the theory that we were just taking into consideration or wanting to take into consideration. So we need to look into new approaches to interpret the synchrony in a deeper way. Many studies have tried to quantify being in sync, air quotes, using one metric or another, right? In fact, a recent review found 27 distinct measures of interbrain coupling used across 215 hyperscanning studies. These range from simple correlations to coherence and frequency bands to phase locking values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Each gives us basically a number or a grand score of so-called synchrony. While these measures have taught us a lot, they usually boil down to an average level of synchrony between two brains over some time. It's like saying on grand average, these two people's brains were X% in sync during a very specifically designed experimental paradigm. So that's useful, but we suspect it's very crude as a summary, right? Why, one could ask. And I'd say that it ignores the rich structure of how the interaction is unfolding and how information routing in the brains might be flowing specifically between regions. So it's a bit like measuring only the overall volume of a conversation or of a band playing without really listening, to the interplay between the melody, in the case of the band, for instance, or which instruments are interacting between each other at the harmonic and rhythmic level, etc. Um, so standard metrics is what I'm trying to say, often overlook these like higher order topological features. The network structure form by which brain regions are coupling with which is what we want to aim for. So, with so many different metrics, it's even the case that it's hard to compare results or build a unified theory, if that's even possible. Each metric has its own assumptions and may favor one imaging modality over another. One way of going about it would be to, do a scoping review or a meta analysis and just understand the upper and lower bounds of the spectrum of methodologies and how they, can be combined with other inputs um, to address a certain aspect of presence or of interactive phenomena, right? Then we could sort of have a consensus on um, what fits what in our attempts of empirically researching presence. So I'm a fan of that, but I think we should also give it a try to just, head for a more general principle descriptor, right? So the metric level of interbrain dynamics can be improved, is what I am betting on at this moment. So that this metric can work across methods and tell us more than just how much in sync we are, and ideally capture the network geometry of the interaction. That is, who's connected with whom and how that structure changes over time. So now we turn towards this math or geometry. And our approach starts with a simple but powerful representation. You treat the two interacting brains as part of one combined network within which the nodes are brain regions in each person. And we draw an edge between a region in person A and a region in person B if their activity is significantly synchronized or coupled. So essentially, each edge represents a direct link of information sharing or co-activation between two brains. Can think of any number of examples here between, frontal cortex oscillating together and that connection becoming an edge in the network. We might choose homologous regions, so the same region, both brains, or any task relevant pair to connect. So the specifics can vary, but the idea is we construct an interbrain coupling graph, IBC graph, for each moment in time. Now, instead focusing on a single synchrony value, we can look at the whole pattern of connections. In other words, the topology or geometry of said interbrain network. Might have clusters, bridges, or hubs, and it might reconfigure as people fall in and out of sync on a moment-to-moment basis, basically asking for reconceptualizing what synchrony even means and whether there might be something as a net positive desynchrony, even uh, depending on the different moments we go through together. So by analyzing the shape of these connectivity patterns, we get an insight into how the two brains are coordinating. Are they tightly coupled in one integrated cluster? Are there multiple subnetworks linking different functional areas depending on the specifics of the paradigm? Does the connectivity spread out broadly, globally, or concentrate more locally between the individuals? So these structural characteristics or aspects might, hold the key to understanding the qualitative aspects of presence beyond just more or less synchrony via more or less sensors. It's how the two minds are interacting, what we want to double down on with this method. And so to quantify this, we turn to geometric analyses. So the key idea here to think of when we talk about geometry is Ricci curvature. So this is a concept adapted from geometry towards networks. In very simple terms, graph curvature tells us how an individual's connection, so the edge between the nodes, shapes the flow of information within the network. So think of each edge in the interbrain network and ask yourself, does that edge sit inside a tightly interconnected cluster, like the red here? Or is it a lone bridge, like the blue here, connecting otherwise separate regions? So an edge with a positive curvature in this case is in a sense a redundant link. The two nodes it connects already share a lot of common neighbors and alternative paths between them. So this indicates a robust cluster of interconnected nodes around that edge. And information that is sent along that edge tends to stay circulating in that local neighborhood. It has been referred because of that as a contraction. Messages sort of like bounce around close by. An edge with a negative curvature on the other hand is more like a bridge between distant communities. So the two nodes connected by that edge have very different neighborhoods with little overlap. And if information travels through that link, it can spread outward into two separate parts of the network. It's sort of expansive. These edges are critical conduits for global information flow. So whoever has more um, interest in the deep math of this, by all means, reach out. But just in the interest of time, I will skip the deeper aspects of this for now. Um, Certainly, interaction isn't static. So people are constantly adjusting, engaging, disengaging. So we need to watch how the interbrain network evolves over time and not just stick with snapshots of the connectivity that I was just describing. If what we want is to capture the flow of presence. So the method that we use to engage with these metrics is a sliding window analysis, as you can see here on the right. So imagine we take, say, a 10-second window over the dual EEG data, build the interbrain network for that window connections um, that can be varying in number of regions of interest, depending on our paradigm. Then compute all edge curvatures for that snapshot and deliver ultimately or output a sliding window that can give us sort of a movie of the network's geometry, right? So let's say you can, grab this orange rectangle on the upper left part of the figure, move it back and forth, and you can see then the different regions in the lower part of the figure, it changing in how they're represented in their edge and node proportions. So for each time window, we don't just get one number, but a whole set of distributions of curvature values across all the edges in that network. So one moment might have the mostly positive curvature edges, a lot of clustering, and another might have more negative edges. So bridging disparate areas. This, taken as a whole, um, is represented by curvature entropy. So the measure of heterogeneity of the network's whole geometry in a specific point in time. Right. Also going to skip a little bit of detail there, just in the interest of time. Um, right. So what do these geometric signals mean in terms of the participant's experience? Here we need to merge phenomenology and quantification of biologically realistic uh, phenomena, right? Or considerations. So to interpret our metrics, we have reached out towards the active inference framework. Um, so a theory that's, in a nutshell, views perception and action as a process of making predictions and minimizing prediction errors. So in simple terms, each of our brains is said to be constantly trying to explain what's going on to reduce surprise by updating its internal model. In a social context, that would extend to say, I'm not only predicting the external world, but I'm also predicting you. Moreover, I'm predicting you predicting me, right? So your actions, intentions, and perhaps associated brain states. So we engage in a kind of coupled inference. So when we're in sync versus when we're not, from that perspective, can have different consequences in its interpretation. If everything is going smoothly in an interaction, our predictions about each other are being confirmed. We're effectively co-regulating our behavior and understanding. This corresponds to a somewhat of steady state in our geometric measure. So the network structure might be stable or only slowly evolving. But when there's something that we would classify classically as, a hiccup, so a person suddenly changes a topic, for instance, in naturalistic dialogue, or there's a misunderstanding that creates a prediction error for the other person, that would be a salient surprise that often has an effective tone also, right? Like, uh-oh, something's off. And our framework links this to the geometry. We formalize affect as prediction error indicating a lapse in self-other coherence that needs to be restructured. So we need to reduce the error and restore attunement. We would like to call it rupture and repair cycles. If we go through that successfully, then the curvature-based measures should reflect the restabilization of the network geometry as synchrony reemerges. Or, as I was saying before, desynchrony is reinterpreted as a positive within that segment of the interaction. Right. And last but not least, um, as I was saying, this work attempts to bridge different ways of knowing, right? We've long discussed how to bridge concepts like the I-though relationship, or what deep intersubjective presence is. And these were largely qualitative phenomenological insights, while on the other hand, neuroscientists and engineers crave concrete like data and models. We're trying to unify rich first and second person experience with empirical measures. So the idea of participatory sense making, as described, um, is given a formal grounding in our model. The sense making part becomes the ongoing re-synchronization of two brains, and our curvature tools map that sense making process, how it strengthens and weakens in real time. I think the most important take home from this project is that we want to create a shared method for multiple disciplines. Right now, I'm happy to share that we are um, wrapping up our proof of concept, and we'll be sending out some manuscripts by the end of the year. So happy to try to test whether it holds true that this can indeed open up this floor for disciplines to cross over around what we call presence. Thank you so much. This final slide with some pictures from my great collaborators.
Now we can clap. See, our little meeting hour is muted, so we have to wait. There's like bated breath in the room until they're allowed to clap for you. But we do clap for you. We thank you so much. We
Thank
are
you.
at time, so I will give one question to the room if anybody has one. Yeah, Olaf Planck at the back. I don't know if you need to come forward because the owl may not reach that far back. But yes, if anybody is more interested in either the idea of writing something on interbrain synchrony, please reach out. Olaf, go ahead.
Oh yeah.
Fascinating talk and the methods. I love it. Just a quick question about, so this is a diet. So this is two people. You must have a lot of thoughts about linking a person to bigger groups. Could your,
Yeah.
I assume your methods could be applied to a group of 10 people, and this I thou could also be of interest there. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you for the great question. Actually, that would be the next natural step for me in this project sort of life cycle. We started with a diet. We even first got the idea by Guillaume here on the lower right to revert back to single brain studies once we have, the method fully tested through the three main modalities that we use, e.g., fNIRS and fMRI, but to sort of like, re-render that single brain set of paradigms that are classic with this new metric. But after that, we certainly want to look into bigger groups. I'm particularly fascinated by the concept of shared intelligence or collective intelligence, like in the direction of Michael Levin, for instance. So definitely looking forward to applying this to larger groups. Yeah.
And the method would be EG, I guess, right? So the method would be EG based, or would
We'll have to. Yeah, we'll have to see. I think with Merle, for instance, we're looking into doing some fNIRS based studies for naturalistic dialogue, following, for instance, Sebastian Speer's publication from last year, Nature Communications, on how friends and strangers adopt different strategies, right? Maybe that can be expanded towards larger groups interacting in actual dialogue, and that you couldn't possibly do with EEG. But I think we need to think of all modalities actually, and we need to see, what we can sort of salvage from each and try to complement a fuller picture by trying to replicate complex paradigms or like segments of paradigms with all modalities to get a more holistic picture of the same target phenomenon.